Topic note 6.4, the intertidal zone. And this is a picture of a very different coastline with a very different intertidal zone than we have here in Florida. This is from Northern California, and they do have an active coastal margin here, and they have a lot of rocky shores. So let's get into it. Our main idea here is that the intertidal zone is defined by changing conditions, and the organisms that live there have a range of adaptations that are used to survive in this environment. Now, there are a significant number of individual learning goals here that help support these concepts and also gives you some targeted information about some of the different animals that live there. So let's get started. Let's begin with the definition, the intertidal zone. An area known as the seashore, which is exposed at low tide and underwater at high tide. This is actually a picture of some Forest Hill students out doing some intertidal research on some of the very little tiny bit of rocky intertidal we actually have here in South Florida. Let's go ahead and look at the different types of intertidal zones that we actually have. First up is the rocky shore, which is, of course, the classic example of that intertidal zonation that we're going to be studying. Now, sandy shores, of course, are formed by the erosion of sandstone and deposition of sediments by waves, and we are much more familiar with sandy shores here in Florida. And then there's the muddy shores. Now, these form in those protected waters, usually in bays or estuaries, things like that, where there's not a lot of water movement, so it's very fine silt particles fall and create that mucky substrate. Then, of course, we have estuaries, which we've already studied a little bit in this course as is. This is where you have that sort of semi-sheltered areas that have mangroves and seagrasses and mudflats and sandy shores and all of that sort of combined, the nursery ground for organisms. It's really a great place. Now, at the mouth of rivers, we have deltas. The picture to the right is the Mississippi River Delta, one of the largest around. And this is where sediments that are transported by rivers kind of get deposited as it flows out into the sea, and it creates these sort of muddy, sandy areas with little channels of water flowing through it. We are going to be primarily focusing on the rocky intertidal zone in this note set with a little bit of time and love spent on sandy shores. Now, rocky intertidal zones are areas with exposed rock. They tend to happen around active continental margins where you have a high current that removes a lot of the sediment, leaving a lot of the rock. Now, rocky shores create stable habitats. It's kind of interesting. You would think it'd be a little bit opposite with wave action, things like that, but here's the rub. It's the substrate for attachment. That's really the key thing, and that allows for higher biodiversity. And when we're looking at the rocky intertidal zone, it is space that is the main resource that organisms are competing for. The term zonation applies to the distribution of plants or animals into specific zones within an ecosystem based on specific abiotic factors like desiccation. As zonation is applied to the intertidal zone, this actually derives from a pair of scientists, Thomas Stephenson and Ann Stephenson. They were a married pair, and they came up in 1949 with what they called the universal or generalized scheme of zonation when we look at intertidal zones. And this to this day is very foundational because it breaks up the zones into the same components we're going to be talking about today: the spray zone, the upper, the middle, lower, and the subtidal zone. Within this intertidal zonation, the upper regions tend to be exposed to air, changing temperature, solar radiation, and desiccation, essentially drying out, whereas the lower regions tend to be more submerged, more underwater, and are only exposed to air for short periods of time before the tide returns to cover them all up. Now, when we talk about the distribution of organisms, we're talking about where they occur in the intertidal zone. Do they occur more towards the upper regions where it's drier? Or do they occur more in the lower regions where it's wetter or even underwater most of the time? And within any particular organism, whether you're talking about a barnacle or a sea star or whatever, the upper limit is usually determined by physical factors. How many of those factors, such as being exposed to air, high temperature, solar radiation, all that stuff, can they deal with? The lower limit of their existence on the intertidal zone, more in the wet zone, tends to be determined more by things like predation and competition for space. So, for example, one of the reasons why you have animals that tend to be able to live in the upper regions where there's not a lot of moisture and they have adaptations for that is because they avoid competition in the lower regions. Let's get into the different zones, and we'll start with the splash zone, which is named due to the fact that it does have splashes of water most of the time, but it's generally above the high tide mark. It's only going to be covered in water in the highest of spring tides. So if you look through, the entire calendar, there might be a couple of, we have here in Florida, we call them king tides, where it gets really, really high. But even then, it's very minimal. But the waves, as they crash down, can send spray up into the splash zone, hence the term splash zone. But you can also have extreme temperature variations because, of course, being exposed to air, if it's really sunny, you're going to get really, really hot. In some of the colder climates, you could actually have the opposite, where the exposure to very cold air makes it very, very cold. So there's these big temperature shifts that can occur here. Now, the marine life that actually live here, first of all, the whole zone is relatively low in diversity. But periwinkles, which are the little snails on the bottom left there, are often found here because they really have some adaptations to suck onto the rocks, retain moisture, and kind of deal with heat. Limpets are another one that you can sometimes find in this zone. But again, it's relatively low diversity. Now we'll descend into what we call the upper shore. Now the upper shore is only submerged during high tide. So during long periods of the day, they can be without water. And then of course, when the tide comes in, it can be then inundated with water. So there's that back and forth. Now this also comes with what we call mechanical stress because as the water comes in and out, it's going to push and pull organisms along. Now, this can also have relatively drastic temperatures because you're exposed to whatever the temperature is in the air during low tide, and then, of course, the water during high tide, so that can shift things around a lot. Now, there is a limited food base here because, again, food-wise, you need either some sort of producer or you have access to algae and zooplankton as they fly through during high tide. So that's where, it comes back and forth. And when we talk about marine life that live here, there's a couple of examples. For example, we've got the chitin, which has a muscular foot that helps it maintain its place in that back and forth water situation. And that there's a picture of that on the bottom left. It's this 8-segmented shell. It's got little furry stuff around the edges. It's kind of neat looking. There's also some algae that can live here. An example is the channeled rack, which is a type of algae. It's this frond-like kind of floppy body type that kind of shifts back and forth with the water flow, and it also can deal with drying out to some degree as well. Now I will note the channeled rack is an example that is not from Florida, but it's one that the ACE has in its book, so I wanted to make sure I pointed out. You can find it in the northeast of the US, you can find it in the northwest too as well, in a little bit more temperate environments rather than tropical. Now here in Florida, we do have some algae that can grow in this zone as well, but it's much more shorter kind of turf-like algae as we go. Now there can also be, just like we saw in the previous one, limpets and periwinkles. So just because we've moved into the upper shore does not mean some of those splash zone animals can't be back and forth in this area as well. All right, let's continue our way down into the middle shore. And here we have a zone that is exposed to air twice a day just during the low tide. So you have long periods of exposure to water with shorter periods where there's no water and there's desiccation, where the animals are drying out. This is opposite from the upper shore, which you have long periods of exposure to air and just short periods of exposed to water during the high tide. So it's kind of a flip on that. Now, here you also continue to have that mechanical stress and tidal currents, especially tidal currents, because you have more time underwater where those currents are moving in and out to and fro. Now, here's some discussing about marine life here. We have a much higher diversity here. There's more competition because there's more organisms there. Now, an example of an animal here is the barnacle, which barnacles kind of cement onto the substrate, and they are filter feeders, which is why they want to be in the water a little bit more often than the upper shore or the splash zone. Now, you can find some barnacles up in the upper shore as well. There are some that are specially adapted that way. So this isn't a strict rule, but this is where you start to see the majority of your barnacles there, because they do need to be able to filter feed for a good portion of the day so they can get food. Now, another example is the blue mussel. Now, mussels, and this could be mussels in general too, there's depending on where you are, but mussels have these basal threads that attach to the rock surface and help to hold them and anchor them so they can deal with that flow and that back and forth. But then they can filter feed during the times in which they are inundated with water and you have zooplankton flying around, things like that. Next up is the lower shore. Now, the lower shore is a zone covered by water most of the time, except for the lowest of spring tides. Now, this isn't every spring tide or any once a month or anything. This is like maybe once or twice a year where you have these really, really low spring tides, very high spring tides, that kind of a thing. Now, the conditions here tend to be a little bit more stable than the rest of the intertidal zone, simply because it's more exposed to water all the time. And that makes a big deal. Now, it also has the greatest biodiversity, which means you also have the greatest competition for space and resources. Here you can see various types of seaweeds, algae, sea stars, sea urchins, sea anemones, oysters, all these sorts of animals. Next up, we have tide pools. Now, tide pools are kind of interesting because they sort of breach the barrier of some of these zones we were talking about, depending on where they are. They're essentially depressions in the rock that retain water during low tide. So you have water trapped in a bit of an enclosed pond, if you will, or a little puddle. Now, this prevents exposure to air for the organisms that are underwater in that tide pool. However, there are some other challenges that come along with that. For example, you can have large oxygen fluctuations. As we know, as water gets warmer, the amount of dissolved oxygen decreases. And so, again, you think about a summer day with a lot of solar radiation coming down, that's going to get very warm. So the animals that are in that tide pool may be avoiding desiccation or drying out, but they also might be exposed to high temperatures and low oxygen. Now, this can fluctuate from day to night, with photosynthesis obviously happening during the day as well. So there can be a lot going on in terms of variability there. Salinity changes can be a big deal as well, because let's say it rains during low tide and your little tide pool is inundated with fresh water. That can really reduce the salinity. And of course, evaporation, on the other hand, can decrease the volume of water in that tide pool and increase the concentration of salts. So that would increase the salinity. So these kinds of changes can occur between the tides, but then of course when you do have an incoming tide, you're going to have a abrupt change for whatever is going on in that tide pool at the moment to whatever is coming in from the open ocean. With our zones laid out, it's now time to get into the various different conditions and adaptations within the intertidal zone. So we'll first start with the regularly exposed to air part, which is a bit of an issue. It's kind of an immersion into air rather than an immersion into water. And the big issue here is the danger of desiccation, which is a word that basically means drying out. Now, there's a couple of things animals and plants as well can do. First, there's this idea called clamming up. This is where you close the shell or seal in moisture. Now, you can see on the picture on the left is a limpet, and it's sealed onto the rock. And this is a good way to clam up, if you will, where it seals itself onto the rock. That way it retains the moisture inside its shell and inside the body and against the face of the rock. Now, there's also things like crabs that can literally move. So as the tide goes down, they move with water into the other zones. So don't think of the zones as being these isolated islands where you can't move from zone to zone, because some animals do. And then, of course, there's tolerating to drying. These seaweeds like fucus over here, or the rackweed, that essentially is adapted to dry out for parts of the day and then get reinfused with water later on. There's also drastic changes in temperature. As the tide comes in and out, or you're being exposed to air or water, these temperatures can change. For example, a hot summer day can get really, really hot. A cold front comes through, it can get very, very cold in the air. The water tends to always mitigate those changes in temperature, but that can also be a variable as the tide comes in and out and exposes those animals to the temperature of the water versus the temperature of the air. There's also drastic changes in salinity. And again, this comes with being near shore. If you get a lot of rain, you can have a lot of fresh water inundated into the system. If you have a lot of evaporation, you can get the water to become very salty very quick. So these changes can be very rapid. Now, how do animals tolerate this? Well, they can do a few things. First of all, they can clam up, just like we talked before. They can also move in and out of, if you're a crab, for example, you can move around. So there's a few different ways. Mechanical stress is a huge factor in a rocky intertidal zone because just by definition, to have that rocky zone, you generally have a lot of water movement to essentially remove sediments, a lot of erosion, but the rocks stay there. And so you tend to have currents, you tend to have wave action. And these things cause mechanical stress, where it's essentially battering animals, making them go one way or direction or another, that kind of a thing. So animals have to have a way to adapt to that. And generally, when species are unable to cope with this, they're found in the more sheltered locations within the intertidal zone. Like you can see those cracks and crevices, tide pools, things like that. Other species hold firmly and attach firmly to the rocks. They can use holdfast. They can actually secrete a type of glue. They can have those basal threads. That picture of the mussel on the bottom towards the right is that hairy stuff coming out of it is the basal threads. They can have suction ability. They can be very thick. They can be very low profile, or they can just be flexible like some of the different algae. Last up, we have availability of space, and this is huge because essentially there's only so much littoral space in any particular zone, and the organisms that are adapted to those zones have to sort of fight and vie for that space. This means not only for dispersal, it means occupying it, and it means displacement and the ability to overgrow competitors or move them out, that kind of a thing. So it can get very competitive, especially when we're talking about the middle and lower shore. All right, now let's shift gears over to the sandy shore. So sandy shores are very unstable. They're essentially made of shifting porous substrate that's composed primarily of sand and silt. Now this term porous means that the substrate has holes essentially that allow water and air to pass through it. This means during high tide, it can be very much inundated with water, but during low tide, it can basically fall out of the sediment due to the porosity, and that sediment can become very dry. The conditions in a sandy shore, again, are unstable. So why is that? So we have wind and waves that can easily move sand and sediment all over the place. They can shift it around. You can also be exposed to air during low tide and risk essentially drying out, desiccation. And the exposure to extreme temperatures is a very real threat as well when you're exposed to the air versus water, that kind of a thing. There are really very few rocks or hiding places because it is so sandy. So that makes it very difficult to hide, and it makes it very easy for predators to access prey. There's also, of course, less places to attach to. So that totally takes out things like barnacles, for example, things like that. When we look at productivity in the sandy shore, the only real producers that are consistent would be phytoplankton. However, you do occasionally have some macroalgae that can take hold in some areas depending on the situation. But another big thing with the food web essentially for sandy shores is detritus, which is found within the sediments, and it's kind of shifted around by currents and tides as well, and that helps provide some nutrients and some food for a lot of the other organisms that are there, especially the ones that live and burrow in the sand, which again helps support things like birds or crabs or anything like that that are hunting for those things. Due to all these conditions, we generally have a low biodiversity. So we have fewer niches due to reduced number of food sources, and usually only a handful of species can really deal with it in any great extent. And they can be found sometimes in great abundance, so a bit of a monoculture, if you will. Organisms tend to burrow into the substrate. That's what we call fauna. And they are mostly detritivores that collect that dead organic material between the sand grains. There is some competition between burrowing animals as well. Let's take a look at some of the marine life that live in sandy shores. First up is the lugworm, Arenicola marina, and this is an annelid worm, so it's a segmented worm that burrows into the sand, and it creates these little U-shaped burrows where you have a little pit that shows you where the worm is actually taking in sediment and sort of digesting the detritus, and it creates that little bit of a pit. And then there's a hole usually next to that pit that you can see like it burps out like tubes of sand, and that's sand that's already processed to find food. Now, lugworms like this can make up around 30% of the biomass of some of the sandy beaches, and they are targeted by predators, and they can actually regrow their tail, which is a bit of an adaptation. So if they get nipped off at the surface of the sand, they can regrow some of that tail. Ghost crabs are a very common sight for people at the beach. A lot of times you'll find kids running around after them, things like that. But they are very well suited for what they're dealing with in this habitat and the food sources that they have. They avoid heat by digging these deep burrows. They can be up to about 1 meter deep above the high tide mark, and so you'll often see them associated with those burrows. At night, they go to the waterline and they look for detritus to consume. Finally, we have the razor clam. Now, this is a large bivalve that lives in the sandy shores. So this is a mollusk. They bury themselves in the sand using their muscular foot to dig a hole. And they do this cool thing where they open and close their shells to make more room and sink further into the sediment. Only a tube called a siphon is extended above the sand, allowing for gas exchange and also to sort of pump stuff out. And that is all for today. So make sure you're paying attention to those benchmarks, and we'll see you next time. Keep learning.